At some point, being unreachable stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like a goal. There's a fantasy that a growing number of people carry around but rarely say out loud. It doesn't involve winning anything, or arriving anywhere, or being recognized for something. It's quieter than that, almost embarrassingly simple. It's just less. A smaller apartment in a slower city, a job that ends when you leave it, a phone that doesn't feel like a leash, weekends that aren't accounted for, a life where the question, "What are you working toward?" doesn't need to have an impressive answer, because the answer is just this. This is what I'm working toward. This ordinary, unannounced, largely invisible Tuesday. Most people who have this fantasy don't fully act on it, but they think about it more than they admit. They scroll past someone's photo of a house in a small town, a meal cooked at home, a walk somewhere without a destination, and something in them responds to it before their mind can explain why. And what's interesting is that this isn't a new impulse. The desire to withdraw from the noise, to scale down, to stop performing for an audience you never agreed to perform for. This has existed as long as there has been noise to withdraw from. What's new is the scale of it. And what's new is that the people choosing the quiet life are not, for the most part, people who lost. They're people who looked at what winning was supposed to feel like, and quietly, without drama, decided they weren't sure they wanted it. This essay is about why that's happening, not as a lifestyle trend, but as a psychological response to something specific in the current moment that is making the small, quiet, largely invisible life feel, to more and more people, like the most honest available option.
Now, examine what the sociological data is actually showing, because the trend is real and its contours are specific. Survey data from Pew Research, Gallup, and several university longitudinal studies have documented consistent shifts in the stated values and priorities of adults under 40 over the past decade. The findings converge on a pattern: declining emphasis on career status and income as primary life goals, increasing emphasis on autonomy, work-life balance, meaningful relationships, and what researchers call psychological safety, the felt sense of not being continuously evaluated and found potentially wanting. The percentage of workers who say they would accept lower pay for more flexibility, more autonomy, or better work culture has risen substantially since 2019. The rate of people leaving major metropolitan areas for smaller cities and rural areas, a trend that began before the pandemic and accelerated during it, has not fully reversed. The decline in social media engagement among younger users, particularly on platforms associated with performative self-presentation, has been documented across multiple platforms. None of these data points individually tells a complete story, but taken together, they describe a population in which a meaningful and growing segment is actively reorienting away from the metrics that the previous cultural consensus designated as success markers: visibility, status, growth, scale, and toward something harder to measure but more immediately felt as real. What's being rejected is not ambition per se. It's a specific flavor of ambition, one that requires continuous external validation, continuous performance for an audience, continuous measurement of self-worth against shifting external benchmarks. The quiet life represents, in part, the withdrawal of consent from that particular arrangement. There is a psychological mechanism underneath this that deserves direct examination, what researchers call ego depletion in its relationship to identity performance. The social psychologist Roy Baumeister developed the ego depletion model in the late 1990s, the finding that self-regulation, willpower, and the management of one's presentation all draw on a limited cognitive and psychological resource that gets depleted with use. The model has been contested and refined in subsequent research, but its core observation has held. Acts of self-presentation and self-management are not free. They cost something. And when the cost is continuous and the recovery time is insufficient, the resource runs low in ways that affect every domain of functioning.
Now, consider what the modern environment asks of a person in terms of identity management. Not just at work, though professional self-presentation has intensified considerably with remote work, removing the physical separation between professional and personal contexts. But across every platform, every digital interaction, every context in which there is an audience, explicit or implicit, for how you present. You have a professional self on LinkedIn, a curated self on Instagram, a more candid self on some platforms, a more formal self on others, a self that your family knows, a self that your colleagues know, a self that your oldest friends know, and the ongoing cognitive work of keeping these selves consistent, of managing the impressions formed in each context, of monitoring how you're being perceived and adjusting accordingly. This management is not optional in the social sense. It's how social navigation works. But its cumulative cost, sustained across every waking context, is real and measurable. And the people choosing the quiet life are often, at some level, choosing to reduce the number of active selves they're required to maintain, to live in fewer contexts, with less audience, with less of the continuous monitoring and adjusting that visibility requires. Not because they've stopped caring about relationships, but because the specific form of relational labor that modern visibility demands has become more costly than the returns it generates. There is a concept in urban sociology called stimulation overload, first developed by Georg Simmel in 1903 in his essay The Metropolis and Mental Life, and later elaborated by researchers studying urban density and stress physiology. Simmel observed that city dwellers confronted with far more sensory and social stimulation than the human nervous system evolved to process, develop a specific adaptive response, the blasé attitude, a kind of emotional flattening, not depression, but a deliberate reduction in the intensity of response to stimuli as a protective mechanism against being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of things demanding attention and reaction. Simmel was describing early 20th century Berlin. What he was pointing at has only intensified. The stimulation load that urban modern life delivers, not just physical stimulation, but informational, social, emotional stimulation, delivered continuously through devices that are present even when the person has left the city, has reached a level that would have been genuinely unimaginable to anyone writing about it even 30 years ago. The quiet life is, in part, a deliberate reduction in stimulation load. Not because stimulation is inherently bad, but because the organism has limits, real physiological limits, on how much sensory and cognitive input it can process before the adaptive responses it develops to cope begin to cost more than they protect. The person who moves to a smaller city, who deletes the apps, who structures their days with more white space and fewer demands on attention, is making an environmental intervention, changing the load rather than trying to build infinite tolerance for the existing one.
Now, I want to examine something that sits at the heart of this trend, but rarely gets named directly: the relationship between the quiet life and meaning. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, writing from the experience of surviving Nazi concentration camps, identified the search for meaning as the primary human motivational force, more fundamental even than pleasure or power. His observation was that people could endure almost any circumstance if they could find meaning in it, and could be destroyed by comfortable circumstances if those circumstances felt meaningless. The modern career, particularly in the knowledge economy, in the professional sectors that attract highly educated young adults in developed countries, presents a specific meaning paradox. The work is often technically complex, financially rewarding, and socially prestigious, and it is frequently experienced as hollow. Not because the tasks are trivial, many of them are genuinely difficult, but because the connection between the work and anything that feels genuinely significant has been severed or was never clearly established. You optimize the metric, you hit the target, you grow the number. And at the end of the quarter or the year or the 5-year period in which you have done this well, there is a specific and disorienting question that the success doesn't answer. For what exactly? The quiet life often represents a search for a different relationship with meaning, one that is smaller in scale but more immediately felt as real. The garden that grows because you tended it, the relationship that deepened because you were present for it, the skill that developed because you gave it sustained attention rather than treating it as a side pursuit squeezed into margins, the community that formed because you stayed somewhere long enough for it to form. These are not achievements by the metrics that the professional world counts. They don't make a LinkedIn update. They don't compound financially, but they are experienced by the people who have chosen them as more genuinely substantial than the things they left behind. There's one more layer worth examining, and it concerns something that the data points toward but doesn't fully explain: the relationship between the quiet life and time. The experience of time, its texture, its felt pace, its relationship to memory, is not fixed. Psychologists who study temporal experience have documented a consistent finding: the subjective speed of time is determined significantly by the density of novel experiences within a given period. Novel experiences require more cognitive processing, create more distinct memories, and produce the felt sense of time moving more slowly. Routine and repetition, by contrast, produce fewer distinct memories and are experienced retrospectively as time that passed quickly, sometimes barely noticed at all. The modern life that the quiet life is often a retreat from is paradoxically simultaneously overstimulating and temporally impoverished. It is full of information and novelty in the shallow sense: new content, new news, new input,
but deficient in the deeper novelty of genuinely new experience, new relationships, new skills being built. The years pass with enormous amounts of stimulation and relatively few memories that feel distinct, significant, or clearly located in time. The people who have chosen quieter lives often report a different relationship with time, a felt sense of days that are slower, more textured, more memorable. Not because less happens necessarily, but because what happens requires more genuine presence, is less mediated, and leaves more actual traces in memory and meaning. The quiet life, in this sense, is not a retreat from experience. It is, for many people who have chosen it, an attempt to recover the experience of actually being in their own life, rather than moving through it very fast while looking at a screen.
Here is what becomes visible when all of this is held together. The quiet life is not primarily a lifestyle trend. It is not an aesthetic. It is not the millennial version of dropping out, or a Gen Z rejection of ambition, or a pandemic era overcorrection that will reverse itself as things normalize. It is a psychological response, coherent, increasingly widespread, and pointing at something real, to a specific set of conditions that the current moment has produced. Conditions in which the cost of visibility has risen, in which the performance of identity across multiple simultaneous platforms has become a continuous background labor that depletes without replenishing, in which the metrics of success have become progressively more abstracted from anything that generates felt meaning, in which the stimulation load of an ordinary day has exceeded what the organism was built to process without adaptation costs. The people choosing to disappear are not failing. In many cases, they are the ones who looked most clearly at what they were being asked to do and asked the prior question, "Why exactly am I doing this?" and found that the answer, once they stripped away the social pressure, the comparison, the ambient cultural consensus about what a life is supposed to look like, was less compelling than they had assumed. What's worth noting is that the quiet life as a choice comes with its own costs that tend to get romanticized away in the version of it that circulates online. Fewer platforms means less professional visibility in economies where visibility functions as currency. Smaller cities mean smaller labor markets and, often, lower incomes. The relationships that deepen when you stop spreading yourself thin across dozens of weak connections also require a kind of sustained, unglamorous presence that is harder than it sounds. The unstructured time that allows processing and rest also confronts you, more directly than a full schedule does, with questions about who you are and what you want that a full schedule conveniently defers. The quiet life is not easier, it is differently demanding. It removes certain specific pressures and replaces them with others that are less visible but not less real. What it offers is not comfort, it offers legibility, the possibility of a life whose scale matches the organism living it, where the demands are comprehensible, where the rewards are traceable back to something that actually matters to you, where the performance of self is reduced enough that you can occasionally locate who is performing. That's a modest offer in some ways. It doesn't come with the upside of the ambitious, visible, maximally networked life. It doesn't generate the particular kind of excitement that comes from operating at scale, from building something large, from the validation of a large audience. But it generates something that a growing number of people, having tried the other version, have found themselves genuinely hungry for: the experience of being somewhere, fully, of doing something because it matters to you, not because it signals something to someone else, of a Tuesday that ends and leaves a distinct, locatable memory, rather than dissolving into the general blur of a life that was always very full and somehow never quite present.
I want to end with something that might seem small, but that I think is actually the center of all of this. There is a difference between a life that is witnessed and a life that is lived. Modern social infrastructure, the platforms, the professional networks, the ambient audience that follows you through every connected device, is extraordinarily good at the first one, at creating the experience of being witnessed, of having your existence registered, acknowledged, responded to by others. What it is not good at is the second one, at the slow, private, largely undocumented accumulation of experience that constitutes an actual life. The conversations that no one else heard, the skills built in private, over years, without an audience, the relationships that deepened because you were in the same place, repeatedly, without a particular reason except that you had chosen to be. The inner life that developed because there was enough quiet for it to develop in. The people choosing to disappear are not, in most cases, choosing to stop living. They are choosing to stop performing living in favor of doing it. To redirect the energy that went into the witnessing, the documentation, the signaling, the continuous management of how their life appears, into the life itself. That's not a rejection of connection. It's a search for a different kind of it. One that doesn't require an audience. One that doesn't need to be photographed to be real. One that exists in the specific, unrepeatable texture of a day that no one else will ever see and that mattered anyway. The quiet life is not about being small. It's about being actual. And in a world that has become extraordinarily good at the appearance of things, at scale, at visibility, at the performance of a life rather than the living of one, choosing to be actual, even quietly, even invisibly, even without anyone watching, might be one of the more deliberate things a person can do. Thank you for staying with Void Wander until the end of this episode. In a world where everything is competing for your attention, the fact that you chose to sit down and actually listen, to me, that means more than you might think. If this episode left something in your mind, even just a small question, a different angle, then it's done its job. See you in the next episode of Void Wander.